down, Charmaine. We have now an opportunity to go to God's Word. In our reading this week, we've been going through the book of Genesis. And it has been, at least my life group, we've struggled. We haven't even been able to get into the New Testament portion because the Old Testament portion is so rich, so many stories there. And I want to talk to you today about being obedient. Wouldn't you like to be more obedient than you are? I mean, think about it. If you could learn something today to help you be a more committed, devoted follower of Christ, wouldn't that be a good thing? Well, I believe that's God's will for you as well. And so, hey, you're in favor of it, God's in favor of it. So I think God's going to share with us some things to help us to be obedient. Here's what I think we're all old enough. We're all adults. Most of us are adults in here. And we can say the truth the way it is. Being obedient to God will spare you more heartache, more suffering, more difficulty in your life than just about anything else. Because His way is perfect. His way is the best way. Not only will it spare you difficulty, but it would probably spare people around you a lot of grief too. Because your disobedience doesn't just affect you and your God. You leave a trail of destruction in your wake. And for them to be obedient would be a good thing. I want to begin with a story. Dave Kraft grew up in a Christian family in the South San Francisco Bay Area of Northern California. His father was a minister, a godly man who worked in the church in South Bay. Young David grew up with his father's love and his father's consistent example. When he was old enough to make the decision for himself, he chose to become a follower of Christ. In time, he also felt the call to ministry. He left his family in California to go to seminary to prepare for full-time ministry. David was a big, athletic young man. At age 32, he was 6 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 200 pounds. He worked with a group of Christian athletes and really felt a call to minister to younger people. Then suddenly, he was diagnosed with cancer. The disease racked his body. Over a period of time, it dropped him from 200 pounds to just 80 pounds. 6 foot 2, 80 pounds. When he was about near the end of his life, ready to die, he asked his father to come to his hospital room. Lying there on the bed, he looked up and said, "Dad, do you remember when I was a little boy how you used to hold me in your arms close to my chest, or close to your chest?" David's father nodded, and David said, "Do you think, Daddy, you could do that again?" The older Mr. Kraft nodded and again bent down over the hospital bed to pick up his 32-year-old, 6 foot 2, 80-pound son and held him close to his chest. His son's face was to his face, and the son simply said to his father, "Thank you for building the kind of character into my life that has enabled me to face what I am going through." David Kraft passed away. Very poignant story of a father and a son. And today, that's what we're going to look at, a story that we're really very familiar with, the story of Abraham and Isaac. It no doubt occupied a lot of discussion in your life group. You know what I'm talking about. A test that came to Abraham. A test that really revealed his own heart. And who did he love more? Did he love his God, or did he love his son? I've said many occasions, and I will keep saying it because it's been true. It has been true, and I believe it will continue to be true. And it's simply this, that God will not allow anything in your life that you love more than Him to be above Him. There's nothing wrong with loving people. There's nothing wrong with loving things as long as they find their rightful place. But in life, when we're not careful, when we don't check things, there are some things that get, well, out of proportion. And we begin to love them more than we love our God. And God, in His mercy, doesn't ignore it. God, in His compassion, doesn't just pretend like it isn't there. He'll take you to that place and ask you for it. In this story, difficult story to read. And I know all of us, at least in the groups that I were a part of, we had to ask the question, what would we do? We could say, as some did, oh yeah, I would do anything for God. I would make the greatest sacrifice of all. And it's easy to say that when you're not asked to make that kind of a sacrifice. But I don't know. Maybe it is. This chapter, chapter 22, is what we're going to look at. So I want to invite you to find that in your Bible or on your phone or wherever you're at. Genesis chapter 22 is our text. We're going to be looking at just 19 verses. But oh, what a story. What a story it is. This chapter contains the greatest test of Abraham's faith, a trial of the magnitude that few people would ever experience in life. In fact, a trial that would break the faith of many. Genesis chapter 22. Before we get there, we should understand that life is full of trials. It is part of God's plan for you. As we have been reading the experiences of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as we're going to continue to read through the Old Testament, we're going to find out that trials were a part of their life, and it's part of God's plan for your life. I don't know where we ever got the idea that everything in the universe should line up just the way that you want, and you should never have any difficulties. That is not what life is, nor will it be what your life is about. There will be trials. There will be difficulties. It's what gives us strength. It is part of the human experiences. We are made that way to be overcomers, to face the challenges. You know, one of the things that we find is wind makes trees stronger. Winds pressing upon them causes the roots to go deeper, and so it is in the Christian life. Until we have these trials, until we have difficulties, we only have a surface faith. It's the really big trials that cause our faith to grow deep. In fact, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12, we are reminded that we should consider this part of the experience of life. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 12 says, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the," what kind of trial? "The fiery trial, which is to try you as though some strange thing has happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. And when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy." In other words, don't be surprised when difficulties come your way. So it's good that you're here this morning. It's good that we have this story, because I believe that if Father Abraham were here today, he could impart to us some important lessons about enduring these trials. But not just enduring the test, passing the test. Trials are going to come. Difficulties are going to come. I'll guarantee it. I'll guarantee it. The only variable is, will you pass? Will you overcome? Will you be victorious? Genesis chapter 22 introduces this big test for Abraham. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. Well, it's always good to hear a word from the Lord, isn't it? What's interesting here is that if you kind of keeping track, it's been a little while since Abraham has heard from God, at least recorded in the scriptures. God has been silent for quite a while, from the weaning of Isaac till about this time. God isn't saying much, or at least that we know about, and all of a sudden, the word of the Lord comes. And I can imagine Abraham going, "Oh, my friend, here I am, Lord." And then, just one statement, one directive, one thing that he is to do. Even though Abraham knew God's voice, that had to sound strange to him. Certainly seemed out of character for the one who brought this son. You got to remember, in chapter 21, Abraham had to give up a son there too. Ishmael had to go. You'll remember, it was Ishmael that was, well, the child of the flesh. The child that when we try to make God's plan come true in our life, we taint it, we mess it up. And God, looking down at what they did, they must have been so proud of Ishmael. And God said, "But I'm not in that." And as Ishmael grew, Ishmael had to go. The time came when Abraham, his firstborn son, even though he wasn't the child of promise, do you think Abraham loved him any less? No, he loved him with all of his heart. And God said, "You have to let him go." And if it, I don't have more than one child, so I'm only guessing. But surely, to some small degree, his pain was lessened by the fact that there was still Isaac. Chapter 21, Ishmael has to go, and now it sounds like chapter 22, Isaac's got to go too. And God called it right. Your son, your only son, I know you don't have any left, the one you love, by the way. God knew his heart. God knew this was not going to be an easy thing. It wasn't flippant. He knew the depth of the love that Abraham had for his son Isaac. It says that he tested him there. I cannot help but to believe that there was a chance. There was a chance that Abraham could have loved Isaac more than God, and because of that, he couldn't be the father of the faithful. There was a call of God upon Abram's life, and the test that he went through is probably more severe than anything that we would ever have to do, but maybe not. A single sentence, clear in content, no further explanation, no opportunity to ask for clarification, to ask for more details, no phone menu to say, if you don't understand the command, press 1. If you disagree with the command, press 2. If your insides are churning, press 3. Nothing. You see, there was only two choices for Abram, and he knew it. Either be obedient or be disobedient. We have this tendency to think there's gray area when it comes to following God, but there isn't. That's a game you played when you were a kid. When your parents told you to do something and you didn't do it, it wasn't that you said no. You just delayed. You just waited. You just wanted to make sure it's what they really wanted. And if they told you 50 times, well, then you would do it. There was no other choice. And so, what happens when God tells you something that you don't want to do? How can you be obedient, even when it's hard? Abraham's going to share with us some lessons in obedience. Are you willing to listen? Do you want to listen? If you'll follow these simple statements, it will be easier for you to be obedient. So here's number 1. Obey promptly. What did I say? Obey promptly. Why is that important? Well, first of all, let's look at Abraham. You got to know when he received that of God, when he heard that, he knew what God had said, and now he had a choice to make. He had a decision to make. Would he do it or not? Abraham did not want to do it. You got to understand that. Somehow we think that in some of these stories, when men and women are going through these great trials, that they just wanted to do it. I would point you to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and that terrible struggle that he went through, and I would say to you with every fiber in my being, he did not want to do it. He did not want to go to the cross. He did not want to endure what he had to do. That was what the struggle was all about. It was an issue of, would he surrender or would he do what the flesh was telling him to do? He says, Father, please let this cup pass from me. So obedience. How do you obey when you don't want to obey? Look what Abraham did. In verse 3 it says, so Abraham arose early. Boy, if there was ever a day to sleep in, if there was ever a day to roll over and hit the snooze alarm, if there was ever a day to say, you know what, I need some space, I need some time, I need to take a day away and think about this. I need to get perspective. I need to pray. Oh, we're good about that one. I need to pray about it. Abraham knew that obedience meant he had to do it then. He had to do it. He got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took the two of his young men with him, Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place which God had told him. He didn't hesitate. If you're going to be obedient, you have to learn, you have to train yourself to obey promptly. Because here's the thing, God doesn't tell you to do something 10 years before you're supposed to do it. He doesn't tell you to do something 10 minutes before you're supposed to do it. That's what children do. That's what disobedient children do. You know what I'm talking about. When mom and dad tell them to do this, and what do they say? In a minute. In a minute. You know what they're doing? They're testing your will. Because I've seen too many parents give in to that. And the child understands that they don't really have to obey if they put it off. Putting off, procrastination in the things of God is disobedience. You know what? God's got a call on your life. God's telling you to do something. Do it now. Even if you do it 10 years from now, that's okay. But you've missed 10 years of God's blessing. You know that, right? That's what we do. We put God off. We stiff-arm him. We hold him out there. We don't ever want to say no to God, but we don't want to say yes, so we delay. We hesitate. And Abraham is our example here. The hardest thing he would ever have to do, he knew, if I'm going to do this, I got to do it. I got to do it at the first opportunity. Why would he need time unless it was just to change his mind? Don't hesitate. Obey promptly. Can you imagine his struggle? Can you imagine how he struggled? Could you imagine all of the reasons that would flood into his thinking of why he shouldn't do this? What would Sarah say? You know how protective she was. She's the one that said, Ishmael's got to go. He's got to go. Nothing can stand in the way of our son. I mean, can you imagine Abraham going to Sarah and say, Sarah, I got something I need to share with you? What would he say? Going to take a little father and son trip and only the father comes home? There's all kinds of reasons why Abraham could have justified not doing this. And I have to confess, it's part of my nature not to do things that I don't want to do, to postpone them. I got a list on my desk. I could probably walk back there right now. There's 3 things on it. None of them I want to do. But I know I have to. I play this game and you do too. You know what? When I was in business, you know when I filed my taxes? I didn't want to do it. I didn't file them on April 15th. No. Those are for the lightweights. You can go all the way to October 15th. Did you know that? Oh, don't tell anybody I said that. Because you can file a couple of extensions. You can go all the way. That's the drop dead date. That's the date. There is, you don't do it then, it's failure to file. It's not just late penalty. It's failure to file. You can't go. For decades, not decades, for at least a decade, that was my tax filing date. My accountant wouldn't even call me before September. He just automatically filed the extension. It was just the way it is. Why? Because I didn't want to do it, and I put it off to the last possible moment. Friends, if you want to be a follower of God, if you want to be obedient to God, the moment God reveals His will to you, do it. It doesn't get better over time. It gets harder. It gets harder. Obey promptly. Now, you've heard me also say, in some of the teaching that we do, look, don't make big decisions quickly. And that's not what we're talking about here. When I'm talking about big decisions quickly and do it, capriciously, what I'm saying is, in things where you don't know the will of God, go slow. Go slow. You thinking about marrying somebody? Go slow. 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 You know why? Because forever is a long time. And that's what you say up here. Till death do me part. You might think every day you're dying, but that doesn't count. Death do you part. So you go slow. So there's times in life when it is appropriate to go slow. But never, listen to me, never when you know the will of God. When God makes it absolutely plain to you what you are to do, salute and charge up the hill. Can I get an amen? Amen. All right, that is how you protect yourself from disobedience. Here's number 2. Obey independently. Independently. Here's the truth that Abraham learned. I know each of us have to learn at some point as well, and that is following God is not a group experience. It's not a herd experience, H-E-R-D. It is a one-on-one thing. It's between you and God. It doesn't matter what everybody else is going to do. You know what happens? Anytime we're around a group of people and we feel like we got to do something, whatever, you know what we do? We look around. We're going to look at whatever. If I were to give you a quiz, a true and false, very few of you would be the first one to raise your hand. You know what you'd do? You'd look at your neighbor. You'd look to see what everybody else is doing. And as soon as you feel confident that the majority of the people are doing something, then you'll join in. When your walk with God, sometimes it's just you and Him. God didn't tell other people to do whatever He told you to do. He told you to do it. And you need to be obedient. You need to be willing to do that. Now, Abraham knew he couldn't invite Sarah into this discussion because he knew Sarah would discourage him. The one that was closest to him. The one that had God worked in a marvelous way. I mean, think about it. An old woman giving birth. I mean, she was old. God did a miracle. And if Abraham say, hey, Sarah, guess what? Guess what God told me? He knew. She might have said, you know what, if God told you that, do that. But he also knew she might prevent him from doing what God had told him to do. Abraham, you're old. You're old. I'm not sure it's all going all the way up to the top. I'm not sure you heard him right. I'm not sure about this. Abraham was sure, and he knew he had to do it alone. Even the servants that he took with him only went to a certain distance, and then he and his son had to go on alone. Alone. There's going to be times in your life when following God means you're going to have to go it alone too. Just you and God. Don't be afraid of that. You need to understand that's how it is in the Christian life. Is your faith the kind of faith that can stand alone when nobody else will stand with you? When even maybe families and friends, I hear the stories. Somebody feeling the call of God on their life to be a missionary or to get involved in some ministry or leading a ministry, whatever, and people and their closest to them try to talk them out of it. Try to discourage them. Try to do that. But yet they feel that God is leading me to do this. Sometimes you just have to go it alone. That's number 2. Here's number 3. Obey confidently. Oh, friends, you're going to have to get to the place where you have to recognize God's plan's better than my plan. And I know when you write it down, if you had 2 little slips of paper and you wrote God's plan, kill my son, my plan, spare my son, it doesn't add up. How could you say God's plan's better than my plan? You can't. It doesn't add up. It doesn't compute. It doesn't make any sense. Sometimes it's just the way it is. But that's when faith gives you confidence that God's way is better. God is not haphazard. God is not just playing with you. He's not just playing games. God has a plan for each one of us. His plan is perfect. His ways are not our ways, so you can't compare the two. You can't even think like God thinks, because God thinks in a dimension that you can't understand, and that is God is not limited by time and space. He sees the end from the beginning. You don't see anything into the future. But you have to trust that God's plan is better than your plan. And that's how you can obey confidently, knowing that God will work things out. What's one of those Bible promises we've learned? Romans 8:28. Is that the one? All things work together for good when you do exactly what you want. No. When you follow God's call. When you do what He wants. And so, a quick reading of this verse. He was confident. Verse 5, chapter 22, verse 5. Do you hear it? Do you see it? And Abraham said to the young man, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad," that's Isaac, "and I go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." He knew what was going to happen at the top of that hill. He knew what God was going to make him do, and he also knew what he was going to do. He was going to be faithful. He didn't chop that wood. Can you imagine Abraham getting up early in the morning, going out and chopping that wood? I've thought about that 100 times. He did it himself. I got to believe that. He didn't just pick up a wood pile. This is the wood that's going to burn my son up. He talked to God during that time. I know he did. He poured his heart out to God, tears streaming down his face. As he put that wood on the back of his son, he had to be just overwhelmed. But he believed confidently that somehow, some way, at the end of the day, Isaac wouldn't be taken from him. How did he know that? How did he know that? Because God had made another promise to him. And that was after he messed up with Ishmael and he had Isaac, that God said, this boy is going to be a great nation. He didn't have any offspring. When Isaac was sacrificed, he didn't have any children. By doing that, it averted, there was no way the promise of God could be fulfilled. And so Abraham believed, if God could make my old wife have a baby, He can raise my son. In fact, Hebrews gives us a glimpse of what was going through his mind. Is it Hebrews? What's that text, guys? Hebrews 4 or 11? Hebrews 11:17. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, who he had received the promises, offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac, your seed shall be what? Called. It's Romans 4 is the one I was really looking for. I wasn't even going to do that. See if you can bring up Romans chapter 4, verse 21. Romans 4:21, it says, and being fully convinced that what he had promised, he was able to perform. He believed that somehow it would come to pass. So he believed, he obeyed confidently. Here's one more. He obeyed completely. 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 It's one thing to get up in the morning. It's another thing to load up the animals. It's another thing to trek up Moriah. It's another thing to prepare the wood and to kind of at the last moment to kneel before his son and say, God, I love you and I have obeyed you as much as I can possibly do it, but I can't go any further. That's not obedience. That's disobedience. Don't fall into that trap of obeying most of what God has told you. Obey completely. And that's where we see. I want to read this. I want you to capture the way the scriptures say it. Genesis 22, verse 6. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And the two of them went on together. I don't think he fooled Isaac. I think it's pretty clear that at some point it dawns on Isaac, I'm the sacrifice. I'm the one that God provided. I am the one. I believe a gut-wrenching question. How would you like to be Abraham and your son look up to you and say, but where's the sacrifice? Verse 9 says, and they came to the place of which God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. By now, it's pretty clear. What's amazing to me is the influence of a godly father on a son. Abraham is pretty old at this point. Pretty old. Isaac is young and strong. Could have easily have overcome his father. He said, Father, you have lost it. But he had such faith in his father's relationship with his God that he was willing to lay down his life. That amazes me. That is absolutely amazing. Never underestimate the influence of your walk with God on those around you. So by now, he knows he's the sacrifice. He knows how this thing's going to play out. I can imagine as Abraham's tying him up, he's saying, Daddy, a little tighter, please. Verse 10, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. I wonder if the story had ended with the death of Isaac, would it change the moral of the story? Would it change how we view faith and obedience? I don't think so. I think like the experience of Daniel, who would not bow, and he's thrown into the fiery furnace. If Daniel had died, burnt up, it would still be an example of faithfulness. Sometimes God doesn't deliver in a miraculous way. Sometimes people do get persecuted for their faith and they're never vindicated. History is full of men and women who have been burned at the stake for their faith. There was no miracle for them except that they felt God's presence so closely they could sing hymns as they died. Yeah, here's a picture of complete willingness to obey. Verse 11 says, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, to me.'" Isn't that good? He killed his son that day. He killed his son. In his mind, he killed his son. In his body, he killed his son. It was done. It would have happened if his hand was not stayed. He obeyed completely. And God honored that. And God took that as his service. What a story. I want to remind you that there's probably not an Abraham, Isaac experience in your future. Few of us will ever be called to make that kind of sacrifice. You know, some people look at this and they think, how could God do that? What a horrible, horrible test that he put Abraham through. But friends, it's not about God. It is about Abraham that is the star of this story. This story has been retold again and again, not because of God's faithfulness. Look, at the end of the day, we know that God is always faithful. He is faithful. He has been faithful. He will be faithful. What is unwritten yet is, will you be faithful? Will I be faithful? Abraham was faithful that day. Abraham got to experience something that no other human being had probably ever experienced. And that was that Abraham knew what ultimately would happen on Calvary, because a long time later, another young boy would walk up that same trail to that same hill with wood on his back and be offered up. And as much as it broke the heart of Abraham to do that for his son, it broke the heart of our Father in heaven to offer up his son. You see, that's why John 3:16, the center point of that is not just Christ, it's the Father. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God loves you that much. So in the days to come, the word of the Lord's going to come to you. The word of the Lord, the test will come, and the question is, will you be obedient? I hope, looking into the life of Abraham, it will help you to be obedient. So how are you going to obey? Say it with me. Promptly, independently, confidently, and completely. You can only do that if you trust him.